still remember the first time I was introduced to Hitchcock movies. I was in high school and it was in a philosophy class. We were having a lesson about psychosis and neurosis. The teacher told us that as soon as we're done with the lesson, I'm gonna show you a movie that is going to shock you. It's about an intense case or an extreme condition when it comes to psychosis. And so we watched the movie Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock. It was unlike any movie I've ever watched before. Hitchcock came about on another occasion when I was still in high school, and this time I was in a literature class. We were talking about suspense, and the teacher wanted to show us a movie entitled The Man Who Knew Too Much. So yeah, I was still in high school when I started getting obsessed with Alfred Hitchcock movies. And then when I moved abroad to pursue my education, I remember a phase where Hitchcock movies became like comfort movies to me. I would watch many of his films and watch them over and over again because they were just too good. So yeah, today I will also be talking about another great filmmaker, actually one of the most famous and also important filmmakers in history, in cinema history. Alfred Hitchcock movies were more than just entertainment. He was someone who put his deepest fears on the screen. Hitchcock is someone who raised the bar and who changed filmmakers' way of perceiving cinema and doing things. And I will talk about this a bit later. There is a uniqueness to his style that no one can actually imitate. And you know that someone has an established style when people start saying like, this is a very Hitchcockian scene or this is a very Kubrickian scene. So this is when you know that you have an established style. He had this ability to create these very interesting and complex characters. He would put them under pressure in his stories, and you expect them to snap or just crack at some point. Hitchcock was often asked, why do you like to make mystery films? And his answer would be, life is a big mystery, and it always has been. So this is how he perceived life. Now I'm going to go back to the early life. Hitchcock was born in 1899 in London. His past shaped him in many ways. His family always lived on the margins. For example, his father was a grocer. He used to work in trade, as they used to say at the time. Hitchcock had a very strict Roman Catholic upbringing. He had a strict father and an overly protective mother. So put that all together, plus a very vivid imagination and all the elements of genius, and you have a person who's always been an outsider, who always felt like an outsider, and someone who was in many ways different. Hitchcock talks about his first memory of fear, his very first memory of fear. He says he was a baby and his mother was holding him and she looked at him and said, boo. He said that this is the very first experience of fear in life. But his first seriously terrifying experience as a toddler, he remembered it vividly, even as an adult. He remembers being sent to a police station when he was 4 or 5 with a note. And as a result, he was locked in a cell. And when they let him out, the policeman looked at him and said, this is what happens to naughty little boys. This is something that his strict father had planned. Hitchcock doesn't even know why. He doesn't remember having done anything bad at that time. Maybe it was just something that his father wanted to do to scare him or to, implement this fear of authority in his child. The policeman was apparently an acquaintance of the father, so he had planned this whole thing out. It was unjustified, but it was also a fear that stayed with him his entire life. Psychiatrists would always tell him that it's okay, it's a fear that is rooted in your childhood. And as long as you're able to go back to this memory, if you're able to identify it, then you can release it, you can make peace with it, and all will be well. But Hitchcock always believed that that does not apply to him, and that he remained his entire life scared of policemen specifically. And he always had this feeling that you cannot trust authority completely. Hitchcock studied at the London School of Engineering. It's also where he met his wife. She recognized him first, but she never approached him because back then he didn't have a job. And at the time, a gentleman without a job could not talk to a lady. If he had a job, he could not approach her if she had a better job than him. After graduation, Hitchcock became a draft artist. He described it as a boring clerical job. They labeled him as the layout man. He would design advertisements. And of course, he was a very keen moviegoer. He would go very often to the movies and he would watch anything. Then there was a time where he heard that an American company was coming to London to open a studio. So he prepared this huge portfolio and he applied for a job designing their titles. Keep in mind, at the time, titles were painted, the title that you see at the beginning of a film. And keep in mind that those were the silent days. Movies were silent back then. Now, Hitchcock, who was very passionate about movies and suspense, eventually threw himself in the world of filmmaking. It's very important to know that he was very much a self-made man. He had to work his way up the ladder to achieve power as well as the know-how of the films that he would eventually make. He was also very smart in a way where he knew how to meet the right people. For example, he became close to Michael Bolton, who took over the studio where Hitchcock worked at first. He was an English producer who was very businesslike and very professional. He also recognized Hitchcock as a potential filmmaker. Michael Bolton ended up sending Hitchcock to Germany to learn the craft and to learn in the best studios. There he learned a lot about techniques, about trick effects, and about the economy of making a movie. He simply amassed a level of knowledge and experience that was unknown to people who would simply say, "Oh, I want to be a filmmaker, bring me a good cameraman." He knew that there was way much more that goes into making a movie than just having a good cameraman and a good camera. Now I'm going to talk about a milestone that sent a tremor into the film industry, and that was the introduction of the talking picture. I don't know why it never occurred to me before that some people have actually lived through this transition between silent movies and talkies. And Hitchcock was one of those people who actually witnessed this change, this very big change in the industry. And I also thought that it was a transition that people welcomed, but I was wrong. I think it was a film historian who described this big change as similar to when the asteroid hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs. It was a big disaster. However, it was a chance for evolution and growth. So in a way, the coming of synchronized sound was that disaster that wiped out silent cinema. So when the talkies came in, everything had to change. Money changed, industries changed, departments, everything related to cinema. Hitchcock was not okay with that change at the time. To him, talkie movies were nothing but photographs of people talking. Hitchcock never fully reconciled with synchronized sound cinema, in that he always expressed his regret for the death of silent cinema. To him, silent cinema was the purest form of the art. But if you can't beat them, you have to join them. And this is what Hitchcock did. Hitchcock remade Blackmail, which was originally a silent film, and it became Britain's first talkie. Now, Hitchcock is a very fascinating case in that you can see him actually grow as a director and learn more about the craft with every movie he would work on. His work in England was very good at this point, and he was surely one of the best directors in the world at that time. And then he was able to marry his sweetheart, Alma. Alma Hitchcock was a film editor. She was raised in the business. She was in many ways Hitchcock's advisor, and she became a right-hand person to him. Hitchcock would always bring a new story home, a new script. Alma would read it. If she thought this would make a good picture, he would go ahead and start working on it. If she didn't believe it would make a good picture, he wouldn't touch it. He trusted her. He was very dependent on her judgment. And that was right from the beginning. And it went on throughout his career as a filmmaker. The problem for him was that he was getting way larger than English cinema at the time. And it was unthinkable that someone with that kind of vision and that level of talent would not be working in Hollywood. There are things that America just did bigger, if not better, than anywhere else. And Hitchcock wanted the best and the biggest. This is where David O. Selznick comes into the picture. David O. Selznick was fresh from producing Gone with the Wind. He recognized Hitchcock's talent and he wanted to lure him to Hollywood. And Hitchcock wanted for years to go to Hollywood, where he knew that, at least the equipment were a great deal more sophisticated. He had this technical side that loved the idea of working with great equipment and great craftsmen. Film crews actually loved working with Hitchcock because he was very technical and he knew a lot about everything. It is true that when he moved to America, he had moved way up into a new class of filmmaking. However, and that was a big problem, he found himself in a subordinate position, having to work for David O. Selznick. In other words, he moved to America, but he was now butting heads with one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, and he was subjected to authority, which he was trying to avoid his entire life. Hitchcock's first American picture was Rebecca. It was very much a British movie, but with an American producer. The experience of making his first American picture was not fun at all to him, and in many ways it was described as a war of a situation. Selznick was this old-fashioned producer who wanted complete control. And he was also known to be a meddler who wanted to put his stamp on everything. I mean, we're talking about a man who stamps every film he produces as a David O. Selznick film. He was all about this idea of producer as author. And you can see that with Gone with the Wind, which went through a mess of several directors. Actually, the unity, or what kept the project together at the time, was David O. Selznick's vision. If you don't know, Gone with the Wind is one of the most famous Hollywood pictures, and its production was insane. You will have to watch it to understand what I'm talking about. Selznick was one of those people who embodied the gold age of Hollywood. His father had been in the business and he was very powerful. His brother was one of the greatest agents in the industry. And David was the man who produced Gone with the Wind. And enough said. By the way, David O. Selznick, like the O in his name, it doesn't stand for anything. He just chose it because he thought it sounded nice. I think it says a lot about his character, the eccentricity. It is true that, he was a dictator, he was very much an interferer on every project, but you cannot deny that he was touched by genius. He loved films, he loved every aspect of filmmaking. It was his passion. By the time he was 35 years old, he was the head of Paramount Pictures. He had his own production unit, and then he started his own company. Selznick was the man who brought Hitchcock into Hollywood. And he might have thought that he can, control him, control his projects. However, Hitchcock was also a control freak, and he was someone who knew how to create a movie that screamed Hitchcock. So now you have two powerful storytellers who were at war. It's also important to understand that Hitchcock was the type of director who believed that the world needs to think about art as coming from one single vision, one single person. Now I'm going to go back to talking about Rebecca and how the project came about. Hitchcock had read the manuscript of Rebecca, which had not yet been published. Rebecca was written by Daphne du Maurier, and Hitchcock was friends with du Maurier's brother. He wanted to buy the rights for the story, however, he couldn't afford it. Then Hitchcock discovered that David O. Selznick was in the process of negotiating the rights for it. And this is where he knew that he could not compete with that, and that David O. Selznick was going to get the rights for it. And fun fact, Hitchcock was actually supposed to direct Titanic at the time, but the project didn't work out. And so they came to him and proposed Rebecca instead. Selznick, right from the start, demanded that Hitchcock would remain faithful to the novel. He wanted every scene in the novel to be adapted and put on the screen. However, Hitchcock's approach could not be more different. He wanted to approach the novel in a way that wouldn't make him slavish to it. His philosophy was, a film and a novel are two very different things. The way he would adapt a novel was to cut it into pieces and then retell it from a completely subjective point of view. This is actually one of the reasons why he didn't necessarily like to adapt pieces of literature, because he didn't want to feel slavish to them. This was a lesson that he learned after having adapted Saboteur, a novel, into a film. He believed that when you adapt a very successful piece of writing, that would shadow you as a filmmaker. He was not interested in taking works that were already gold. He was more interested in taking works that were less interesting, less successful, and turn them into something great. So there was a lot of back and forth between how faithful his own adaptation would be to the novel. Selznick would try to convince him by saying that fans of the book would be very disappointed if they find that the film is very different from the novel. They would not be able to tolerate any, deviance from the original. Selznick had bought the rights to a best-selling novel. He wanted to see this best-selling novel on film. This back and forth went on again and again, and it ended up souring Hitchcock to the film. he did not enjoy the process at all. Now, the story of casting Rebecca is interesting because there was this direct attempt by David O. Selznick to repeat what had happened with Gone with the Wind, where they had virtually cast every single actress in Hollywood for the role of Scarlett O'Hara. Again, with Rebecca, they tested many people, and most of the actresses were very famous. But Selznick was smitten by Joanne Fontaine. So they say that this might have had something to do with her casting. I actually discovered that there was this feud between Joanne and her sister. They were known as the Haviland sisters. And Hitchcock, who always had his crazy ideas, had this fantasy of actually casting both sisters without them knowing that they were both cast. And he would film them in a scene where they would meet all of a sudden, and he wanted to film their reaction. But of course, that never happened. It took forever. It took 6 months, almost 6 months, to cast Joanne Fontaine. It is actually known that this character is very hard to play because it's a character that is always overshadowed by a grand force. The character has no name. She basically doesn't have her own identity. If you don't know the story of Rebecca, it's about a rich man who marries a girl after his wife passed away, and he's trying to find his deceased wife in his new one. And everyone in the mansion where he lives is obsessed with his deceased wife. They are always comparing the new wife to the old one, and this ends up crushing her and suffocating her in many ways. Now, Laurence Olivier, who was meant to play the husband, was not really thrilled with getting Joanne Fontaine, which this story upsets me a lot because I think the shooting of the film was not very enjoyable to her. He was very uptight. He was very irritable with her, I think. He had actually recommended his wife, Vivian Leigh, who was in America at the time. She actually plays Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. At the time, they were having a love affair, both actors. And Vivian Leigh wanted the part. She had asked him to try and get the part for her. Selznick did not believe that she was right for the role. He thought that the character was not good enough for Vivian Leigh. At the time, Joanne Fontaine was not a bankable name, but Hitchcock wanted her. He believed that he was able to, get a good performance out of her. He took care of her throughout the shooting. He took the time to coach her, and she ended up actually winning an Oscar in her next film. So she grew a lot as an actress from this experience. Now, Fontaine said that you always knew when David O. Selznick was on set because shooting would always stop. This is how much Hitchcock despised his presence on set. He could not stand Selznick. He did not want any, kind of control freak looking over his shoulder. He also tried to keep him out of the loop as much as possible. He would never show him what they did throughout the day. He would never show him anything he was shooting. And thankfully, Hitchcock has, managed to refuse a lot of the cheesy suggestions made by David O. Selznick for the picture. For example, there's this very beautiful scene in the end where the huge mansion is in flames and there's fire everywhere and characters running around. David O. Selznick wanted the smoke coming out of the fire to form the letter R for Rebecca, which was, the character who's the source of obsession in the story. Hitchcock did not do that, and thankfully so. Now, they both learned something from this experience. Selznick learned that he could never tell Hitchcock what to do, and Hitchcock learned that as long as you kept Selznick busy, you can get away with anything you want. And at the time, Selznick was busy with Gone with the Wind. When Rebecca was starting, Gone with the Wind was nearing completion at the time. Now, Rebecca was nominated for Oscars, and Hitchcock was nominated for Best Director. However, he didn't get it. However, Rebecca won Best Picture. So David O. Selznick won an Oscar. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Hitchcock's way of working. Because in Rebecca, Hitchcock had displayed technical expertise never seen before in Hollywood. He had shown and he had proven that a film is an assembly of small bits to create mood and create emotion. Hitchcock was known to film tiny bits. He never shot masters. And shooting a master is shooting an entire scene where you have everything in one scene. And Selznick was very horrified by this way of working because it's not something that he was used to. And he realized that Hitchcock was shooting the film so that you would only be able to edit it in one way, and that was his way. He was someone who was very well prepared ahead of time. If you see his storyboards, the storyboards are so detailed. He has every scene that he wants to shoot in a storyboard ahead of time. He knows every shot, every angle by heart. so that when shooting the picture begins, he rarely even looks at the script. Because at that point, he will have learned the dialogue himself. He used to compare himself to a conductor who would conduct an orchestra without a music sheet. And like I said previously, what made Hitchcock movies special was that he never shot a master. The camera was constantly moving. He was constantly shooting tiny bits. The editors were always given pieces to link together, and that's it. This is why they jokingly say that any person could have edited Hitchcock's movies. He never had any extra shots. He shot exactly what he had previously envisioned, and all the editor had to do was just link those scenes together. In other words, there was literally nothing to edit. Now, we're going to move on from Rebecca, and I'm going to talk about his 1942 film, Shadow of a Doubt. And this is where you see Hitchcock's understanding of the Americana. At that time, Hitchcock had already been in America for 4 years. So this was really his first American picture. The environment of the film showed this ideal community. And in this ideal community where people are happy and life is wonderful, comes this evil influence personified by this Uncle Charlie guy. At that time, America was nearing the end of its war with Hitler. And so the darkness that creeps into this idyllic small town is reminiscent of the darkness that would enter the American experience in World War II. Now, in his next film, Spellbound, this one is very interesting because in it, Hitchcock explores the world of a man who had lost his memory and who suspects that he had committed a terrible crime. The movie has Gregory Peck as the main actor, and he is one of my favorite actors. From then on, you will see how Hitchcock's insight into fear gave him a series of hits that were made with Hollywood's brightest stars. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about fear and cinema. Hitchcock was often asked about his relationship with fear and why he likes to put fear in cinema. He was once asked if there is a specific rule above all, which is indispensable for a movie director who wants to frighten the audience. And Hitchcock believes that the director needs to understand the psychology of the audience. He also believes that for some inexplicable reason, the audience like to, as he says, dip their toe in the cold water of fear to see what it's like. He even gives roller coasters as an example. He says this is why people like to go on roller coasters and they scream, and then when they come out laughing and giggling. Hitchcock is known as the master of suspense, and he is the master of all kinds of phobias. He was someone who was frightened of basically everything. He was scared of success, he was scared of failure, he was frightened of being hit by a car, frightened of illness, heights, wide open spaces, claustrophobic spaces, all sorts of things. But the only difference between Hitchcock and other people was that he was able to put his fears on film. He was successful in entertaining people with his movie Spellbound. I mean, I talked about Gregory Peck, but it was also one of his first pictures, first of many, that he did with Ingrid Bergman. She was said to have been probably his favorite actress. Actually, from his days of working with Ingrid Bergman, Hitchcock was in this habit of falling in love with his leading actresses. He loved having beautiful women under his control. It is also believed that he fantasized sexual, even marital relationships with his leading actresses. So besides his phobias and his fears that he would display in his films, he would also display his most secret desires for the whole world to see. To be honest with you, even the kissing scenes in his movies, they feel a bit uncomfortable. They feel uncomfortably close, uncomfortably intimate. François Truffaut, who was very close to Hitchcock, he's a very famous film director who had extensive interviews with him. He literally studied Hitchcock's films. And he says that if you watch, for example, the kissing scene in the movie Notorious, you will see how you have Ingrid Bergman, you have Cary Grant, and you will feel Hitchcock's presence, who is filming from the off space. This is where we will also join them as members of the audience. They also interestingly describe Hitchcock's leading man, the leading man for most of his films, Cary Grant. They describe him as a surrogate of the man that Hitchcock would have liked to be. In other words, they say that through Cary Grant, he used to live out his fantasies. So yeah, people suspected that he was in love with Ingrid Bergman. She was also an actress who was known to be very close to her directors, and she had numerous international, relationships. So there's always been a mystery behind their relationship. Now, with the success of Notorious, the movie that he did with Bergman and Cary Grant, Hitchcock became one of Hollywood's most bankable directors. He ended up with a very good contract with Warner Brothers, and the production for the first film he did under contract began in 1950. That also marked the beginning of a very successful period of his career. As a matter of fact, he said to everyone on the first day of shooting on the set of Strangers on a Train that his career begins today, and that nothing that he did before counted. And he did other good films for Warner Brothers. But the real work, his real career began with Paramount. Because as soon as he went to Paramount Studios, he found the ideal working situation. He started working on Rear Window, and he proceeded to make an unbroken series of 9 masterpieces. By then, Hitchcock was labeled as the master of suspense. Now, how did Alfred Hitchcock define suspense? He says that you need to understand that suspense is a contrast to shock. Imagine a group of men sitting around a table and they're having a board meeting. During the meeting, a bomb explodes. When that happens, the audience will have 5 seconds of shock. But if you tell them ahead of time, let's say 5 minutes ahead of time, if you show them that a bomb is gonna explode and the characters are unaware of that, the audience will be on edge throughout these 5 minutes. Shock lasts for seconds, but suspense lasts for minutes, or as long as you want it to. And Hitchcock loved creating this experience or, this feeling for his audience. Now, I'm gonna talk about some of those masterpieces that he created, starting with Rope, his 1948 film. I remember watching Rope for the first time, and I could not believe that such a movie was made back then. It still remains one of the most fascinating movies I've ever experienced. I was hooked throughout, and I was mesmerized by the filmmaking. Rope is actually based on an English play. The original title was Rope's End. Hitchcock wrote the screenplay in collaboration with Mr. Cronin. They had to rethink and re-edit the whole thing to turn it into a picture. Because, again, a play and a movie, 2 very different things. There was also this challenge of turning everything English to American, because it was different in many ways. Like, there was talk of the class system and, societal stuff that could not be more different. Now, one of the interesting things about Rope is that to everyone, it seemed very obvious that it was about homosexual characters. Though the word was, of course, never mentioned. We're talking about the 1940s. At the time, they would refer to it as, it. The film was about it. The actors were it. This is how they would, talk about it. The movie was actually more successful in Europe when it was released because the subject was less of a taboo. It was less problematic in Europe at the time. And keep in mind, there was a very, strict censorship at the time, so it was inconceivable to allude to that or to mention any words related to that topic. They say that they even had to scratch out expressions like "my dear boy" if it's uttered by a man. That's how strict the censorship was. Despite the very low-key manner in which the subject was alluded to, it is still considered as one of the most sophisticated films on the subject. And the script is brilliant because you will notice that it's very stuffed with double meaning. Now, Farley Granger, the actor who plays the character of Philip Morgan, he had come out of the Navy. He went to New York and he started working in plays, acting in plays. He fell in love with theater and he also shot 1 film. He was asked to go to the studio to pick up the script for Rope that he knew nothing about. In Rope, there's also one of the main characters is a teacher. Hitchcock thought about his ideal actor at the time, Cary Grant, for the role. He also thought about Montgomery Clift, but apparently both actors turned down the roles because they didn't want to be associated with homosexuality or it. So the role went to another actor that Hitchcock really likes. I think he acted in 3 different pictures with Hitchcock, and that was James Stewart. Another actor that I love very much. Now, I'm going to tell you very briefly about the story of Rope because it's very interesting, very fascinating. It's a story of 2 guy friends, who were very influenced by their teacher who had taught them a Nietzsche philosophy, which was the philosophy of the Superman. Now, very briefly, the Superman philosophy is about a person who creates their own values instead of following society's rules. It's less about being superhuman in power and more about self-mastery, independence, and becoming who you choose to be. Those two boys had taken their teacher's words and they had taken this philosophy to an extreme. Apparently, the teacher would tell them that killing is okay if you are ridding this world of useless people. He believed that some people are superior than others, and if a person is useless, then it's okay to kill them. Anyway, he explains it extensively in the movie, but it's crazy to see how these boys took this philosophy to an extreme and they decided to act on it. They considered themselves as superior and they decided to unalive their third friend just for the fun of it, just to prove that they are superior and they can do it. And this is how the film actually begins. We see them strangling their friend. And the terrifying thing is that they were supposed to host a party that day for that friend because he was supposed to go to college or travel or something. So they wanted to host a farewell party. They invited this friend's parents, his fiancé, and their teacher, this professor that they admire so much. One of the most amazing things about this film is that throughout the film, you can see how this act that they committed, you see the consequences and how different the consequences were on both friends. Brandon, who seemed right from the start more in control and more confident in what he was about to do, he was completely okay with it throughout. Everything was fine. However, you will notice that Philip was gradually falling apart. As soon as the murdered friend's parents walk in, as soon as he sees the parents, he starts falling apart. And throughout the film, you see how Brandon is trying to prevent Philip from falling apart completely. I will not tell you what happens in the movie. I will not tell you how it ends. It's a fascinating movie to watch. And I genuinely, if there's a Hitchcock movie that I would recommend, I think it would be specifically this one, because it is unlike anything you will have ever watched. Rope has a very small cast. So it was very important for Hitchcock and the screenwriter to give importance to each and every character that you see in this film. It was also very important to build the character of David, the friend that they murder at the beginning of the movie. He is not there in the film, however, you sense his presence. You sense that it was a real character. He has history. You learn a lot about him throughout the movie. Now, the screenwriter was a little bit against including the murder scene at the beginning of the movie because he wanted the audience to wonder if David is actually murdered and he's there in the apartment somewhere. But Hitchcock didn't want that. He wanted to open the movie with the murder scene. And oh my god, the ironic thing is that they put him inside a chest and then they put a tablecloth on top of the chest with candles. They turn it into a kind of altar or something. And then Brandon, one of the boys, decides to serve food from the chest, to turn it into a table. Imagine how sick it was that they were serving food to the guests from the boy's grave. And this is the line that James Stewart says in the movie. Now, the shooting of the film was a whole nother beast. With Rope, Hitchcock decided that he wanted to make it seem like one long, continuous shot, which in a way makes it seem like you were watching a play. It was made to look like one continuous shot, but it was not made into one shot. It's actually 9 or 10 separate shots linked very seamlessly. I think Hitchcock was the first person to use this technique in a movie. I remember they used this technique in the movie Birdman, which is to this day one of my favorite movies of all time, and in the movie 1917, which was even more challenging because it was a war movie. I highly recommend those two films, by the way. You should watch them. Now, in order to make it happen, Hitchcock had this idea of ending scenes by zooming in on someone's back, reloading the camera, and then pulling back out. They would literally shoot 10 minutes at a time. Imagine how challenging that is. Imagine being an actor in the scene and then making a mistake and having to go back and reshoot 10 minutes. It was also a challenge for them to walk around and act naturally when in reality, they had to be careful because they had wires under their feet. Furniture pieces were being moved around all the time. Even Hitchcock was very nervous about that. They had to be careful about the camera. It was a very mobile set. They were moving things around, they were moving walls around to accommodate the actors and their performances. By the way, the entire movie was shot in one place, in one tiny portion of what is supposed to be an apartment. They have this huge window in the background, which was painted. And you can see how it was gradually getting darker and darker. I don't know how they made this happen. Like, it starts in the morning and then we end at night and there's the sunset in between. So they must have had the exact painted to make it look like different times of the day. It's crazy. Rope was also Hitchcock's first movie in Technicolor. Anyway, enough about Rope. Please watch it if you haven't. Please. And I promise you it's worth it. Now, in 1955, Alfred Hitchcock started his own television series, and it was entitled Alfred Hitchcock Presents. It began in America, and it was very successful. It became one of the most popular television shows ever made. Of course, he did not use the same techniques that he would use in filmmaking. It was a different thing. The budgets, the economics, it was a very different way of handling things. And keep in mind that TV is more fast operation than feature films. The show is very interesting because Hitchcock appeared at the beginning of every episode and at the end. He often had very funny introductions, very funny commentaries. For example, for one of the episodes, he was talking very monotonously and without emotions. He was saying, "I have recently become very wary of becoming a sex symbol and I have decided to return to television. I remind you that before I pose for photographs in magazines, I was known for a man of mystery and suspense. To re-establish my reputation as a man of intrigue, join me as I bring you this story, and notice that I do so while fully clothed." And there's an episode where you see him ironing clothes in the opening for some reason. So it was from this TV series that you understood that Hitchcock was very good at making fun of himself. So besides being a very successful, very good show, it also made a character, or like a figure out of him. It was actually after this TV series that he became very well known as a person. And after that, he couldn't go anywhere without being recognized. You need to understand that Alfred Hitchcock's personality was an asset to him. Besides being a master of suspense, he was also a master of creating his public personality. He discovered early on that by making a character out of himself and making a character for the press, that would be a very smart way to draw attention to himself and his films. His name became bankable, and he created a persona that became very iconic. I think everyone knows what Alfred Hitchcock looks like. If you look at his signature, by the way, he even includes a caricature of his face, of his profile, his side profile, in his signature. Hitchcock was always immaculately dressed. You never see him not in a suit. Even while directing his films, he lived this persona at work. He took this concept of making a character out of himself a step further. Hitchcock is known to make a cameo appearance in every one of his films. You just have to find him. It's not like he's a character that comes in and plays a role. No, sometimes you notice him in the background, sometimes you see him walking a dog somewhere. So yeah, all that turned him into an internationally known figure. If you think about it, there's a lot of amazing directors who are only known by name. For example, you have David Lean. I personally love David Lean movies. I think he's one of the great directors of all time. He was a genius, but I couldn't tell you what he looks like. Most directors would do their thing and then that's it. It's up for the studios, the actors to promote and do their thing, but no one knew anything about the directors. But Hitchcock was always there. He was always next to his actors. He's very present in everything that he did, pre or post-production. Now, I'm going to talk about Rear Window, another great film, 1954. Rear Window is also another movie that takes place in one setting. It's based on a short story by Cornell Woolrich. It's originally published in 1942 under the title It Had to Be Murder. In this film, Hitchcock had cast James Stewart again and Grace Kelly. I remember watching Rear Window and watching Grace Kelly in a movie for the first time in my life. I had always known who Grace Kelly was. However, I saw her for the first time in Rear Window. And I remember after watching the movie, I immediately messaged my mom and I told her, "Oh my God, I just watched a movie with Grace Kelly in it," because my mom is a cinephile as well. And we would talk a lot about old Hollywood movies and actresses that we admired. But I remember being obsessed with Grace Kelly after having watched Rear Window. I remember everything about her. I remember the beautiful wardrobe that she had, the black dress, the green suit thing that she wore, her accessories, the pearl necklace. the red lipstick she had on. And I remember falling in love with loafers because of Grace Kelly. Grace Kelly is one of the reasons why I love to wear loafers. It's her, Michael Jackson, and Audrey Hepburn. She was absolutely stunning in this movie. So charming. She was also perfect at playing her role. In the movie Dial M for Murder that she previously did with Hitchcock, she was a bit stiff. Hitchcock asked the scriptwriter to spend time with her and to expand on her character. And that's what he did. Her dialogues allowed her to let her creative energy out. Actually, the screenwriter enjoyed writing for James Stewart and Grace Kelly. And I will tell you this, they were so good together in this movie. Not only as actors, but I loved their characters so much. James Stewart plays the character of a photojournalist who was stuck in his apartment because he had broken his leg in his last assignment. Grace Kelly plays the role of his girlfriend, who was a fashion model. She was very sophisticated. She obviously came from a rich family. Their lives were so different. He was trying to prove to her all the time that we shouldn't be together because you don't fit in my world. I live dangerously. I live recklessly. How can you be with... You can't follow me around in my... No, me no. Okay. Just, no, not the mic. Are you gonna purr into the mic? No. خليك هيك. No? Cat intermission. What was I talking about? Yeah. So he loved her. They loved each other, but he was reluctant to get into a relationship with her because he knew that he lived very recklessly. And throughout the movie, she's trying to prove to him that I want to be with you despite everything. I'm willing to follow you anywhere, no matter the assignment. That's all I'm going to say about the relationship. And then you will see how she's going to prove that. She's going to prove that she's very brave, and she's going to prove that she's very resourceful and very smart. Now, let's talk a little bit about production. Hitchcock had sent a team of 4 photographers to New York, specifically to Greenwich Village. They were to shoot the village from dawn till midnight, in all types of weather and from various angles. The thing is, Hitchcock didn't want to shoot on real location. He didn't want to shoot in an actual apartment. So this assignment was very important, not only to understand and to recreate realistic lighting, but he also wanted to find the perfect inspiration to build the set. Everything was built. You watch the movie and you would think that it's shot in an actual neighborhood. It's not. At the time, it was the most expensive set built in Hollywood. Construction happened in Stage 18, which was one of the largest sets in Paramount. Over 1,000 lights and an incredibly complex wiring mechanism were used to simulate real light. The set was so well built that some of the actors chose to actually stay in their apartments for the duration of the filming. Not only was it a realistic urban scene, but it was also functional. I will tell you very briefly about the story. It's about, again, the character that is played by James Stewart. His name is Jeffries. He's stuck in his apartment because he has an injury, like I said. And facing him, there's an apartment where a couple lives. And the wife is obviously bedridden. One day she disappears. Jeffries is sure that the husband killed his wife. And he's trying to prove that throughout the film. And that's all I'm gonna say. Now, Vertigo, 1958. This movie has a very special place in Hitchcock's heart. It is said to be his most important picture. When Vertigo was released, it was not one of his greatest hits. However, time gave it justice. Today, it's regarded as Hitchcock's masterpiece. Some directors, for example, Martin Scorsese, he says that he always finds himself drawn to this picture again and again. This is a quote that I really love. Scorsese says that it's like being drawn to a whirlpool of obsession, a very beautiful, comfortable, almost nightmarish obsession. Think about the contrast. It was a very highly personal film to Alfred Hitchcock. In 1951, he went to San Francisco for the opening of Strangers on a Train. Hitchcock always loved showing his audience a familiar setting and then introduced to this setting an unexpected twist of malice. As he studied the visual splendor of the Golden Gate Bridge, Hitchcock realized that San Francisco would be a great setting for a suspense film. He really loved the city. He thought of it as the American Paris. He found it to be very cosmopolitan, more than any other city he had visited at that time. But it would be 6 years before the romantic and mysterious images that he had in his mind would make their way into the screen. He wanted the script to be perfect before he would even consider working on the project. With his wife Alma, he would spend months trying to construct and perfect the story before he would find a script writer to collaborate with. I think he had to work with 2 different screenwriters until he was satisfied with the script. They wanted a main character who had a lot of emotions. Hitchcock's idea was the more emotions the character had, the stronger the picture would be. The basis of the story, not the plot, the seed of the story is one true human emotion. It's about the obsession of a man who had truly fallen in love for the first time in his life. James Stewart would again take the lead. He plays a detective with a fear of height, hence, the title Vertigo. Vera Miles, a very beautiful actress, she was supposed to play the main character. Hitchcock wanted her for the picture. She was actually in contract with him. However, she was pregnant at the time, so she couldn't play the part. Hitchcock was very upset, but he chose Kim Novak instead. He wanted someone perfect to play this very mysterious Madeline in the movie, and Kim Novak was very perfect. Now, an interesting fact is that Vertigo was photographed in a Paramount process called VistaVision, which was an extremely high quality process. You will notice that the movie is actually very beautiful. Like the colors, the contrast in the colors. It also has a glow to it. Some scenes, you feel like it's glowing. Principal photography began in San Francisco in 1957. Hitchcock's cinematographer at the time, Robert Burks, he carried out Hitchcock's color scheme of greens and reds. He also used a fog filter to give this dreamlike effect. And the screenplay was followed religiously. It took at least 2 years to write, and so they had to follow it. And as usual, the prerequisite of his work is a very detailed storyboard. Hitchcock wanted to choose James Stewart because he wanted a character that people would relate to. He believed that James Stewart personified every man. He wanted the people who went to see his picture to be able to put themselves in the shoes of the character. Now, Kim Novak had a challenge of playing 2 roles. She plays the strange and aloof Madeline, and Judy, who is her earthly reincarnation. So she had to play this dual personality, and she was very interested in the process. It is said to be the finest performance of her career, actually. Kim Novak says that she adored working with Alfred Hitchcock. She was very nervous at first, but he showed her that he trusted her. He was very patient and he gave her a lot of liberty. Now I want to talk about Edith Head. Edith Head was a costume designer. She's actually one of the most celebrated costume designers in Hollywood. And together with Hitchcock, they worked on at least 10 movies together. Yeah, she was his most consistent costume designer. She shared his fondness of color to heighten emotion. And fun fact, if you ever watched The Incredibles, the Pixar animation, Edna Mode, the tiny bossy fashion designer, she's actually based on Edith Head. They also look alike in many ways. She loved working with him, but Vertigo specifically was a bit of a challenge because he had very clear ideas about what he wanted the character of Kim Novak to wear. Especially when it comes to the gray suit, there was this problem with the gray suit. Kim Novak didn't want it, and Edith Head knew that gray is not really a blonde's color, but Hitchcock wanted it. There was something off-putting about it. He wanted to use that. There's also a scene where she wears this very dramatic green gown and is put into this very red setting, a restaurant with red everywhere, and the contrast was beautiful. There's also this memorable white coat with this tiny chiffon detail that's flying in the back, especially in the scene where she's running and the waves are very wild at the beach, and it added a lot to the drama of the scene. It was very pretty. More than 50 different sets were built for Vertigo. Hitchcock had a lot to say when it comes to interior design, and for Vertigo specifically, he had these sketches that they actually made happen. They turned them into paintings and then they ended up building them. He was very specific about everything. He had control over every department in filmmaking. They also built this staircase that looked like an expressionistic painting, and it actually gave actors vertigo. So yes, Vertigo Again, highly recommended, especially if you love art, if you love drawing. I think this movie is very visually inspiring. Now, we reached Psycho, 1960. Hitchcock had finished working on North by Northwest, in which Cary Grant also played the main character. He was getting ready to start working on post-production when he read an article in the New York Times about a best-selling novel. And he started reading all these good reviews about Psycho. So he asked his assistant many times to call the studios and try to get coverage on it. Hitchcock had to go to England at the time, and he saw the novel at the airport. So he bought it and was even more determined now to get the rights for it. Now, the novel is said to be more violent than the film. However, the reality on which the novel is based is way, way more violent than the novel itself. One of the reasons why both the novel and the movie are very popular is because they are largely based on truth. The real story of Ed Gein is a story that shocked the nation. You know, it became part of American mythology. If you're not familiar with Ed Gein's story, he was a Wisconsin man whose crimes shocked the US in the 1950s. He killed at least 2 women, and he used to exhume bodies from the graves. Inside his house, police had found various human remains like skin, skulls. His actions were driven by severe psychological disturbance, and that was largely caused by an obsession that he had with his very strict mother. He was found mentally unfit for trial, so he spent the rest of his life in a psychiatric institution. By the way, there's a show on Netflix. It was the 3rd season of Monster, which was the Ed Gein story. If you do watch it, don't think it's very accurate. There's a lot of inconsistency with the actual real story. This is why they shouldn't have called it the Ed Gein story. They could have called it an Ed Gein story. Now, this case, Ed Gein's case, has inspired a lot of fictional characters, and among those is Norman Bates, the main character in the novel Psycho, in the movie Psycho, as well as, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre story and The Silence of the Lambs. It inspired a lot of fiction writing. Now, for Psycho, Hitchcock collaborated with Joseph Stefano, who I think is a brilliant screenwriter. For this picture, Hitchcock decided he would return to black and white. He wanted to make a black and white movie. His idea was the movie would have been too gory if it was in color, and he simply wanted to make it for as little money as possible. He also used the crew he worked on for his TV show. Psycho was a very low-budget movie. They had to work a lot on the screenplay because in reality, the character of Norman Bates in the novel is very different from the one in the movie. In the movie, Norman Bates is younger, he's more charismatic, and more importantly, you are able to sympathize with him, which is what Hitchcock and the screenwriter wanted. Stefano's idea was, as soon as Marion, the female character, after her death, we are supposed to switch our sympathy from her to Norman Bates. And we cannot do that if they would have left Norman Bates as he was in the novel. They had this idea of this very frail, young, sad, sympathetic character. Hitchcock thought of Anthony Perkins for the role. I'm not going to say much. I'm not going to say anything other than Anthony Perkins was perfection in this movie. Hitchcock also chose Janet Leigh to play the character of Marion. Fun fact, Janet Leigh is Jamie Lee Curtis's mom. He sent her the novel along with a note asking her to please consider playing the role of Marion. The reason why he was worried that she might not accept the role is because her role was kind of short. She dies early on in the movie. He promised her that they would work on the character, that they would develop it a bit more, and it was a no-brainer for her. She immediately accepted. She really wanted to work with Hitchcock. Now, right from the start, Hitchcock explained to her that the camera is the most important thing, and I only want you to pay attention to the camera. And you have to move, you have to walk, you have to do everything according to my camera. Some people found that very frustrating, very unnerving, but for Janet Leigh, it was a challenge. She took it as a challenge. She really enjoyed working with him. Actually, you can see that in the movie. As soon as the camera starts moving, Janet Leigh would start walking. She had to pay attention to the camera. It was not the other way around. He also chose Martin Balsam, an actor that Hitchcock also liked. He plays the detective in the movie. He did it so well. He was really good at playing that role. He was a New Yorker, and Hitchcock had a thing for actors who came from New York. Hitchcock's daughter also has a role in the movie, a small role at the beginning. Psycho is one of those movies that proves how ahead of his time Hitchcock was. So many different camera shots that are just mesmerizing. As for his cameo, Hitchcock wanted to do it early on in the case of Psycho. He didn't want the audience to be focused on having to find him while watching the movie. So he thought to himself, I will appear early on and then everyone can relax and focus on the movie. Symbolism is a very big thing in Psycho. For example, Hitchcock thought about showing lightness at the beginning of the movie, and you can see that even in the clothing of the characters. He wanted to show contrast between the beginning of the movie where everything is light and the disaster that's going to happen afterwards, the darkness. He had this very long discussion with the costume designer. They were thinking about Marion's clothes, specifically the lingerie that she was wearing. They were thinking, should she wear black? Should she wear white? And so they decided that the movie would start with her wearing white lingerie, and then later on, after we see that she committed a crime in a way, she stole money, she was having an affair and all that, we see that her lingerie switches to black. It was so interesting. Like even her clothing, her handbag, the handbag that she carries at the beginning of the movie is white, and then she carries a black handbag. By the way, having an actress wear lingerie at the time was very daring. I think she was the first one to do it. In the 50s, there was a very strict censorship, so it was very unusual. Now, another fun fact, a very random one. Psycho is actually the first movie where they show a toilet, and specifically a toilet being flushed. Before that, it was not allowed. It was never showed on film. The screenwriter specifically wanted that. He wanted the audience to be unsettled by it. In Psycho, you can also see Hitchcock's terror of policemen. There's a scene where the policeman stops Marion while she was driving. She rolls down the window, and the policeman's face is it literally takes up the whole screen. Janet also said that working with Anthony Perkins was a joy because you never knew what he was going to do. With every take, he would improvise, he would do something new. So she was very excited about having to react to whatever he was going to bring. He was also a very great friend to her. Anthony Perkins is such a sweetheart who excelled at playing a psychopath. He had an incredible grasp on who Norman Bates was. He understood him. He understood his character so well. Now, besides the symbolism that I mentioned when it comes to the clothing and the colors, there's also a lot of symbolism when it comes to food. And you notice that in many of Hitchcock's movies, there's always mention of food and sex, food and death. It's always there. For example, in Rope, you have this idea of serving food from David's grave. There's also something unforgettable in Psycho, and it was something that Anthony Perkins himself suggested. In various scenes, you find Norman Bates chewing on Halloween candy. In the 1950s, of course, there was also censorship when it comes to nudity. In the murder scene where Janet is, being stabbed everywhere, there was no way they could show her naked. So they also had to find a way to cover her up. So they came up with this idea of plain moleskin that dancers would use to cover their blisters. So they covered Janet's parts with that. And it was nude color, so it was perfect. Now, Janet Leigh worked for 3 weeks on this film. Again, her role was somewhat, she had a small part. And shooting the shower scene took 1 week out of the 3. It was several shots, several angles, lighting was different. It was very challenging. There's also this very iconic shot that people were very intrigued by of water coming out of the shower head into the camera, and you have no water droplets on the camera. Back then, there were no special effects or anything. It was tilted in a way that made it perfect. And as for the stabbing scenes, Hitchcock had the prop department bring in different types of melon, and he wanted to choose the perfect melon for the stabbing sounds. Now for the blood, they also tested out a lot of things. They tested movie blood, they tested ketchup, but they settled on chocolate syrup. It had the right density, and it looked good in black and white. One of the most iconic shots in Psycho is after the death of the character of Marion, you have this very slow zoom out from her eye. And Janet Leigh said that at that time, because they didn't have automatic focus, it was very difficult to do. They had to keep focusing, and she had to hold her pause the entire time. It was very hard. There were water droplets that were trickling down her face, and it felt so itchy. It was so maddening to her, but she had to do it, and it was perfect. At some point, she felt that the moleskin thing that was covering her was slipping, and she was very aware that there were a lot of people watching her from, the stage and everywhere around her. She said, I don't care. I'm going to hold my position because I don't want to do this again. Hitchcock says that Psycho was his first attempt at a shocker. Indeed, it was. It shocked a lot of people at the time. Some people could not even believe that someone had made a movie like that. Hitchcock preferred his English films because he thought that American people didn't really understand his sense of humor. And he was often not allowed to do the things that he was allowed to do in England. But with Psycho, he took all the liberties that he wanted, and it was a Hitchcock movie through and through, without any compromise. Another fun fact, when Psycho opened, all around the world, there were cardboard cutouts of Hitchcock himself in the lobbies of movie theaters. It said you cannot come in after the film started, which was an unheard of discipline at the time. And they literally did, as soon as the film started, they closed the doors. No one was allowed to walk in. So finally, I'm going to talk about The Birds, 1963. After having finished Psycho, Hitchcock was looking for a story. Remember Daphne du Maurier, who wrote Rebecca? The Birds was a short story written by du Maurier. Robert Boyle was taken aback by how strong the story was. He thought of it as a mood piece. The image that he got in his head was The Scream by Edward Munch, the very famous painting. That became the main inspiration. And in many ways, in the movie, you can see a lot of scenes reminiscent of that painting. Hitchcock saw that this story has a lot of cinematic potential. In short, it's an apocalyptic story. It's about birds who start inexplicably attacking people. And the setting is an isolated little farmhouse in Cornwall. At the beginning, they were wondering if they could actually physically attack this project. At the time, there was the blue screen or the green screen technique, but it was not really advanced. And at the time, it was not up to the level of Hitchcock. So he opted for the sodium process. It's something that they used at first in Disney studios. It's basically combining foreground and background together. So you have, let's say, an actress who shoots a scene on a boat. They add a background to that. So they could shoot things at different times. The Birds was one of the hardest pictures to shoot because it was so technical. And of course, Hitchcock being Hitchcock, he wanted to be extremely prepared for it. As usual, he started by drawing the entire film, not himself. Of course, he had a storyboard artist. It was so beautifully drawn. It was so detailed. Every scene that you see in the storyboard, it was actually filmed. Now, finding the girl. I'm gonna bring again this topic of Hitchcock and his leading actresses. I already mentioned how he lusted over his actresses and that they were in many ways the embodiment of his fantasies. There also seemed to be a very obvious Hitchcockian woman. If you notice, they were always blonde. He was asked about that, actually. According to Hitchcock, blonde is traditional in film, and the audience always expects a Mary Pickford. He talks a bit further about the tradition in cinema, that the hero is always a dark man and the heroine is always a blonde, and that was, at the time, the simplification of identification. I don't think that was the reason behind his choice of actresses. I think they were very specifically chosen to suit, his taste, his fantasies. There was something very common about them. Besides the fact that they were blonde, they were very beautiful, very elusive and untouchable. Until a fellow like Cary Grant comes along and changes all that. They say that it was Hitchcock's personal burden to look nothing like Cary Grant. This is why Cary Grant was in many ways, his alter ego or his wish fulfillment. He seemed to always want to cripple James Stewart in his movies for some reason. However, Cary Grant was always this debonair charmer. Now, in The Birds, Hitchcock's fantasy spilled over to reality with his starlet, Tippi Hedren. I also fell in love with Tippi Hedren after watching The Birds. Tippi Hedren was modeling in New York for about 11 years. She had also done a number of commercials. One of the commercials ran on the Today Show every morning. Hitchcock happened to watch this commercial and he sent for her. He sent people to go and find the girl, as Tippi Hedren would say. It was October, Friday the 13th. How ironic, it was Friday the 13th. Tippi gets a call and she is asked if she is the girl from the Seago commercial. She said yes, and she was asked to go to Universal Studios to discuss a project with an executive. They would not tell her what the project was. They would not even tell her who the director was. So she went to that meeting, and she went to another meeting to meet other executives, and they would also not tell her anything about the project or the director. Then she was asked to go see an agent. His last name was Citron. I forgot his name. And that agent told her that if you agree on all the terms, Mr. Hitchcock would like you to sign this contract. If she signed the contract and if she agrees, they would take her to Paramount to meet Alfred Hitchcock. Tippi Hedren signed a contract with Alfred Hitchcock before even meeting him. At first, she thought that she would be part of his television show. She didn't think that she would star in his upcoming movie. She went to Universal, she met with Alfred Hitchcock, and she said that they talked about everything except for the film. Then she proceeded to do a very extensive screen test. In the screen test, he wanted her to read for 3 different roles, very different ones. She read from Rebecca, she read from To Catch a Thief, and Notorious. Hitchcock was her coach. He trained her along with his wife Alma. And for the screen test, they needed a leading man, and Hitchcock flew Martin Balsam from New York to be her leading man. I don't think she was comfortable with him. I remember watching the screen test, and I think he made her uncomfortable. And also in one of the interviews, she said that of course it had to be Martin Balsam because there are no other actors in Hollywood. I think she was very bitter about it. She was very uncomfortable. The screen test took 3 days. They prepared this very special wardrobe to her as well. She was dressed so beautifully. And then the screen test came out. They watched it together. Then Hitchcock took out this very beautifully wrapped package. It was from one of his favorite shops in San Francisco. Tippi opened it, and inside was this beautiful brooch of 3 birds in flight. He looked at her and said, "We want you to play Melanie Daniels in The Birds." She started to cry, and it was all around very emotional. Then the work began. Rod Taylor was chosen to be his leading man. I love Rod Taylor. He's such an adorable human being. And he was also very charismatic in the movie. Hitchcock hated to film on location. They had to do that for this movie. He hated to shoot on location because of the editing that goes after that. You have to fix the sound, you have to do dubbing. It wasn't his cup of tea. He preferred to shoot in studios. Louis? They had to work a lot with birds in this movie. Some real, of course, but they also had mechanical birds. It was so difficult to make this movie. Now, you need to know something, that Tippi Hedren loves animals. Another reason why I really love Tippi Hedren and why I think she's very special, Tippi Hedren was obsessed with big cats, aka lions. Tippi Hedren lived with lions. I'm going to show you some insane photographs. I'm going to insert them as I speak. I don't understand how brave you have to be to believe that you can live with a lion when you also have a family. And she did a lot for animals as well. Like, she has a reserve in Shambhala in Africa. Yeah. So she said that she loved working with the birds. And there was this one crow that she talks about. His name was Buddy. He was so sweet. He would come to her trailer and hop around. And he was such a sweetheart that he couldn't be in the movie because he didn't have a mean streak in him. So Tippi became friends with him. And I'd like to believe that this was the crow that she did the photo shoot with. I was obsessed with this photograph for the longest time. I think she was smoking and there was a crow next to her. I love the photo shoots that she did for this movie. There was also a crow named Archie, and Archie hated Rod Taylor for some reason. He would bite him every day. Even if Archie was not on set that day, he would fly in and just to bite Rod Taylor and leave. Now, I'm gonna go back to talking about Tippi and her relationship with her director, because Tippi Hedren had a lot of hardships on the set of The Birds. And later on in Marnie, by the way, she did another movie with Hitchcock called Marnie. First of all, there was a lot of technical demands. She literally did so well in this movie and it was very difficult. She was also psychologically not very comfortable because she was the leading lady of a Hitchcock movie when in reality the studios didn't want her because she was an unknown. She was a new actress, but Hitchcock wanted her. Shooting The Birds took 6 months, and towards the end of shooting the film, she started noticing that Hitchcock kept watching her a lot. He was always staring at her, even if he was standing somewhere, afar and talking to someone. His focus would be on her. Eventually, it became more like stalking. Tippi was so uncomfortable that she would always try to find a reason to leave the room. Wherever he was, she would find something to do just for the sake of, being away from him. But at the same time, she was having an incredible time shooting the film. She was giving it her everything. She was very devoted to playing this role. She wanted to do well. During the filming of Marnie, the situation became intolerable. She literally felt that she was the object of someone's obsession. She describes it as oppressive, as frightening. She was followed around everywhere. Her handwriting was even being analyzed. She was always being spied on. He would control who she would see in her private times, who she was dating, who she was hanging out with. He made demands on her that no one would ever acquiesce under any circumstance. Being an actress under contract was a very, very dangerous thing, especially if the director wanted to take advantage of that. At the time, Tippi had no one she could go to, no one she could complain to. The term sexual harassment in and of itself was not a term at the time. It didn't exist. One day she found out that she had received a Golden Globe Award. She was invited to go on a show, on The Tonight Show. At the time, they hadn't finished shooting Marnie. However, she knew that it was okay. She could take she wanted to ask for just a few days off so that she would go receive her award and go to the talk show. However, Hitchcock did not allow that. And that was when he made very inappropriate sexual demands on her. That was the final indiscretion and the moment that destroyed everything. She told him, as soon as I finish shooting Marnie, I am out of here. He said, you can't, you are under contract with me. You have a family now, your parents are getting older, who's going to take care of you? She said, I don't care. No one who loves me would want me to be in this situation. And this is where he very coldly told her, you can't do that, because if you do, I'm going to ruin your career. Tippi responded, do what you have to do. I'm going to finish working on Marnie and I'm out of here. When The Birds came out, Tippi was a hot actress, as the saying goes. Everyone wanted her in Hollywood. She would later find out how many directors wanted her for their film. And the one that hurt her the most was François Truffaut, who wanted her as a leading lady in one of his pictures. But in order to get to Tippi, they would have to go through Hitchcock first. He turned all the propositions down by simply saying, she's not available. It is true that Hitchcock destroyed Tippi Hedren's career. She was an amazing actress, wonderful in The Birds and Marnie, but then for the life of me, I cannot name any other movie I've seen Tippi Hedren in. Now, fun fact, Tippi Hedren's daughter is Melanie Griffith, a Hollywood actress, and Tippi Hedren's granddaughter is Dakota Johnson. Hedren would have had a wonderful Hollywood career instead of just being known as the actress from The Birds, or instead of being known as Dakota Johnson's grandma. It's so sad. Her story makes me so sad because she was the only actress who suffered at the hands of Hitchcock. It's so disturbing because the way he behaved on set, the way he behaved at work, was so different from his personal life. He seemingly had this perfect family life. He always said that he is very much in love with Alma, and everyone saw that. He was a family man, he loved his family, and yet he is someone who gave hell to his leading actresses. Now we're nearing the end. Hitchcock was rejected by Tippi Hedren, but he also found himself out of touch with cinema audiences. He was into his 60s then. He had been a director for 40 years. So he started feeling his age. He started getting weaker and weaker. He had painful physical conditions. He had arthritis in his legs. He couldn't move like he used to before. A younger generation was starting to take over Hollywood at the time. He did not find it easy anymore to find subjects for his films. He didn't have Cary Grant. He didn't have James Stewart working with him. However, he had one last film left in him. Actually, two. He did Frenzy, and The Family Plot was his last film. After Frenzy, his health started to seriously decline. His final years were not happy at all. He became an alcoholic. He didn't have friends anymore. He was lonely and he was living in this fear of being forgotten. He also had dismay in his own discretion in the whole Tippi Hedren affair. Those who worked for him still at the time, those who maintained his office, witnessed all of that, and they saw how sad it was. All this success, all this glory, all this passion, everything started to fade away. It was so sad. Hitchcock's life was all about spinning out his fantasies. And when he could no longer do that, when he physically couldn't do that anymore, he died. And so on April 28th, 1980, Hitchcock died of liver failure. He was 80 years old. You know, they say that despite all his successes and despite this very confident persona that he put out there, Hitchcock was always deeply insecure. He lived all his fantasies, he put all his dreams on film. However, not everyone saw that, but Hitchcock's personal and private life had a lot of turmoil in it. Things that only he knew about, things that only he felt. He was a very eccentric character, he was a very complex personality, and that showed in many ways through his behavior on set. Practical jokes are not an uncommon things on film sets. However, Hitchcock took them to the next level. Some of the things that he did were seriously malicious. For example, he once handcuffed an actor on set, gave him laxatives, and left him there. That's extremely malicious and cruel. He also got away with all sorts of outrageous things. There's an actor, his name is Martin Landau. He worked on Notorious. He remembers that one day on set where he had to be punched in a scene. Of course, it had to be a fake punch. And then he hears Hitchcock ask his assistant, "Does Landau have to work tomorrow or the day after that? Because I really want him to be punched in the scene." He had a scene with James Mason. He said, "I really want James Mason to punch him. I want his jaw to come out, and that's not something you can fake." And during The Birds, by the way, they had this scene with Tippi Hedren being attacked by birds, and she was told that they would be fake, mechanical birds. However, Hitchcock, without telling her, used real birds, and she was really attacked, and she was really terrified. She was repeatedly attacked for several days, actually. This experience was not only physically but emotionally traumatizing to her. I think it was a scene that they used in the movie because I remember watching a scene towards the end. It looked like she was not there anymore, as if she was going crazy. It felt realistic, and I don't think you can fake that. Hitchcock was very ruthless. He had this willingness to push his actors to achieve realism. And his actors were also willing to do anything for him, and they went to great length to achieve what he wanted. Despite that, he belittled them, even though he could have done nothing without them, if you think about it. He once referred to actors as cattle to be shoved about. And then he later said that this is only a joke. He adds, "But they really are children, And one problem that one has with actors is coping with their ego. But they also have to have this ego, and they have to be ultra-sensitive, otherwise they would not be able to do what they are asked of them." Some people believe that he probably envied their job. I think Hitchcock low-key wanted to be an actor. This is why he liked to make a character out of himself, and why he liked to make these tiny appearances in his movies. He was actually asked once if he was ever tempted to be an actor. And you know what he said? He said, "Nothing so low as that." Some people say he was an easy man to work with, as long as you knew what you were doing and as long as you did it. He found a lot of difficulties working with American actors specifically. They wanted everything spelled out for them. They worry about the content. He did not care about the content. He said that a film can be literally about anything you like, as long as you are able to bring a reaction out of your audience. A friend of his who worked closely with him in the industry said this very interesting thing about him. I'm going to read it as it is. Hitchcock was neither an angel nor a demon. He had a white sadistic streak that was always at war with the most gentle, childish plea for love and acceptance. I think he did have this dichotomy in him. He was desperate for attention. He wanted to be loved. He wanted to be the center of attention. But at the same time, he had a mean streak. He had something malicious to him. A lot of people who, especially those who worked closely with him, were very saddened after they lost Hitchcock. But art director Robert Boyle, who worked closely with him, said that he was a storyteller, and I don't think storytellers ever really die. Hitchcock was nominated for Best Director 5 different times. He never won. Despite his obvious greatness, they say that Hollywood only saw him as an entertainer. It genuinely seems impossible that he has never won. Now, it is very simple to say that, Alfred Hitchcock is one of those directors who raised the bar, but in his case, raised the bar how? Alfred Hitchcock redefined the grammar of cinema. He turned suspense into science. He made the camera psychological. The dolly zooms in Vertigo, the point of view shooting that makes you feel complicit in a scene, like in Rear Window, where you feel like you are James Stewart looking, across the street. He elevated editing and storytelling. He blurred high art and mainstream cinema. And he controlled every detail when it comes to movie making. So all these things, future directors try to emulate, and they still do. And let's not forget that he experimented very boldly with the medium. For example, he was the first person to think about, making a film that seems like one continuous shot. Now, finally, I just want to talk about pure cinema, because Hitchcock used to use this term a lot, pure cinema. And I kept thinking to myself, what does it mean? What is pure cinema? What he seems to have meant by that is that he wanted to use as often and as much as possible visual means to tell a story on screen, not necessarily dialogue. Pure cinema meant to him communicating through pictures. Now, don't forget that Hitchcock came from the silent era. And I think it's something that stayed with him. I'm going to give you an example of pure cinema. For example, a chase scene. It's not something that you can find in a novel, let's say. In a novel, you have to explain what's happening in a chase scene, let's say, or you can say the characters were chasing each other. A chase scene is not feasible on stage, for example. It's not feasible in theater. It's purely a cinematic thing. By the way, if you watch Hitchcock movies, you will find these very long scenes where nothing is being said. For example, you have this whole sequence in Vertigo where James Stewart's character is literally following around Kim Novak. She goes to the museum, she goes to the bridge. Nothing is being said. We feel like we're in the car with him and we're following another character. In Rear Window, for example, you have a scene where James Stewart is observing his neighbor and then he falls asleep. It starts to rain and then things happen at night. You hear noise outside. The character wakes up again. Nothing is being said. We're just there with him. We're waiting. So there's this theory that Hitchcock always remained at heart a silent film director. He actually always had this fear that cinema would go from being moving pictures to photographs of people talking. Now I'm going to tell you one last thing. One of the great things about Hitchcock movies is that, and literally people say that, if you turn off the volume, you can still understand what's happening. And that's all I have for you today about Alfred Hitchcock. Prepping for this episode, I realized something. I realized how much I miss old Hollywood. I love those old movies so much. I felt nostalgic to a period of time where I didn't even exist. Something about that period of time, that period of filmmaking, feels very cozy to me. And again, as a person who loves art, I spend my entire life drawing and trying to find inspiration for my illustrations. Hitchcock is one of those artists, one of those storytellers that have given me throughout the years a lot of inspiration. If you do love drawing, I suggest you watch some of his films, take some screenshots, try to reproduce the scenes. They're so gorgeous. I literally have them cataloged in my head, some of my favorite scenes, and it's always been a dream of mine to actually have those stills printed and framed. I would love to see them in my house. Very specific scenes from Psycho and Vertigo. By the way, I remember when I decided to watch his movie Suspicion, just because I had read about this scene where Cary Grant is holding a tray with a glass of milk and walking up the stairs. It was a black and white movie and you see the glass of milk glowing. Apparently Hitchcock decided to put a light inside the glass. It was such a beautiful shot. I watched the movie just for this scene. Now, if you're interested to know more about Hitchcock and know more about his process, the way he sees film, the way he talks about the medium, I highly recommend this book. This literally it's an interview book where François Truffaut sat down with Hitchcock for a lengthy period of time. They spent, I don't know how much time together. He wanted to pick his brain to learn all about Hitchcock. And this book is just a beautiful book. If you love films, I think this one would make you happy. It has a lot of stills. I think I would have included some of the photographs in the video. It literally has all of Hitchcock's movies here. and facts about the movies, quotes by Hitchcock, and you have information about every film, like how many Oscars it was nominated for, who was the producer, who was the screenwriter. So for cinephiles, I think this would be very educational for you as well. Now I'm gonna, of course, end it with a quote, and today I chose the following. Hitchcock says that cinema is not a slice of life, it's a piece of cake. Thank you for watching, and see you next time. And cut.